Hello, dear brothers and sisters, my friends, my fellow truth seekers. Salam alaikum. Shalom. The topic for these sessions will be that Muhammad is a fictional character or a personified character. So Muhammad, according to my research, never existed. So why this is important topic and why this is need to be taken seriously with open-minded. If you are truth seekers, if you are an educators, we owe to ourselves what we read and what we put in our head, because narrations or narratives that we put in our head shape our behavior. The narrations and all words that we put in our minds shapes our way of thinking and shapes our habits and will eventually becomes character. So with that in mind, I have a few materials, a lot of materials with me, and I'm hoping you will take plenty of notes. So among them is Sahih al-Bukhari, and this is Sahih al-Bukhari. This is by Al-Munawwara Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Let's see, you can see this. Okay. And then I have the longer version of the same book. This is Sahih al-Bukhari, 9 books altogether. This volume also published by the same publication, Al-Munawwara, Saudi Arabia. Many Muslims don't have this collection in their library, but you can access all of these online these days. So speaking of traditions, Islamic traditions, especially about Hadith, that's going to be related to Sharia Law. This is one of them, the book of fiqh. This is Reliance of the Traveler. And then also some other books, many out there, but this is among them, the Unsheathed Sword. Okay, and why I brought this into the surface, it is because those type of books, and that includes Sirah Muhammad, that includes Asbab Nuzul, of course, and that includes opinions of Imam al-Ghazali, that being championed by Muslim to advocate these very hadith. So very important to understand that these materials that I have with me, this hadith, and including the books of fiqh, which is that express the Sharia law, this material cannot create the Islamic golden age. This book cannot enlighten you to become the best version of yourself. These materials cannot take you to the higher self, to become the most productive, the most effective, so you can contribute to become useful for yourself and become useful for your community, and you can contribute to the better world. Nothing like that. So the character portrayed in this book, which is the center of the character, is Muhammad, or what Muslims consider as the last prophet. The problem for me is one of the things. There are many other issues, but one issue that troubles me, that we are asked to love the prophets beyond loving ourselves. That is impossible, psychologically not healthy. Especially when the prophet's asking you to do harm for yourself and to others. And that's why there's so much misery in Islamic communities. And that includes one of the pieces also relate to how the Prophet Muhammad asking Muslims to annihilate the Jews so Muslim can go to the heaven. So this is the hadith that you will find in that collection. This is one of them. This is by Sahih al-Bukhari about eliminating the Jews and hate against other groups that become problematic for everybody. So the same hadith that I just mentioned concerning eliminating the Jews so that Muslim can go to heaven by Sahih Muslim. Okay. So many other areas that we can talk about, but we can't spend so much time because so many of them. But that's kind of things that troubles me, that I'm having a hard time to cope with. So, and that's why I'm trying to understand, to educate myself, to study, to think, and what is Muhammad that we find in the Quran. So, two resources talking about Muhammad, the state or what it means and what the Quran is trying to convey. If the Quran is coming from the divine providence, only the Quran and the Hadith that I think will help us understand what is Muhammad. Okay, so we are going to look into the information that we have from the Quran. Okay, I'm going to present some of the verses. I'm not going to quote the whole verses because you have to study on your own. And also we are going to look at how the Hadith itself and immediately about the fictional character that it portrays and how to find out. So, like I said, the topic of this video is to present to you my understanding based on my contemplating that Muhammad in Islamic tradition, in Islamic scholarships, is essentially a personified character, a fictional character. Okay, so let's jump into what the Quran can tell about the notion of the seal of the prophets. Let's look at verse 40, chapter 33. And the piece of that verse is wa khataman-nabii. It is important to understand that the Quran, that's my understanding, the Quran rejects the notion of the last prophets. The Quran also rejects the notion of the last messenger. Because the Quran rejects the notion of the last prophets, that means the Quran also rejects the notion of God presenting by that last prophets. When the Quran rejects the notion of the last prophets, the Quran also rejects the notion of Islam presenting, articulating by the book of Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and other book of Hadith, including the book of Fiqh, which is expressing the Sharia Law and such. Okay, so the question becomes why the Quran has nothing to do with the notion of the last prophets. It is because conflicting with principles of nature. Because so much what you're going to find that Muslims claim the law of God that you will find in Islamic scholarships, that you will find in Sharia law, are conflicting with principles of nature. So that means Allah or God in Islamic tradition or Islamic orthodoxy, God's law conflicting with principles of nature, which is problematic. So that is the essence of why the Quran rejects the notion of the last prophets. And it is not compatible how this nature works. And we are going to unpack about the concern and why I think that having understanding, having the clarity what Muhammad is in the Quran is one of the most significant aspects that I find quite profound. So first, let's look into verse 61, chapter Al-Baqarah. An-nabiyina bi-ghayril haq. The notion of Nabi or an-nabiyina, those cannot be just assigned for a selected few. Okay? And then also Allah in verse 62, chapter 22, Zalika bi anna Allah huwal haq. Within Allah must contain facts, must contain something that intrinsically true in nature, cannot be convoluted and cannot be conflating with conspiratorial narratives, cannot be conflicting with myth. So, verse 62, chapter 22, Zalika bi anna Allah wal haq. And then verse 61, chapter 2, and I quote the portion of the verse, An-nabiyina bi-ghayril haq. Those two components must exist in nature, must be accessible by humans, everybody, so you can understand what it is, so you can understand the substance, so you can understand the intricacy and whatever the subject matter trying to present to you. Those two components cannot be existed 1,400 years ago and then cannot be existed only after you die. Okay? So what we are going to talk about, those two components must exist within yourself, in everybody, so everybody can have full access to it and can study and explore, and what those two components will present to you so you can make the most of it to guide you to better person, to become the higher self, and whatever you want to call it. So then, why that is important? Because that how you can cultivate aswatun hasana, to cultivate character ethic, which fails what you're going to find in this book. The reason the Quran rejects the notion of the last prophets, because the teaching of the last prophet, what you find in this book, cannot produce aswatun hasana, cannot produce the Islamic golden age, cannot produce the higher self, cannot produce the best version of yourself. You can this material what you have in here cannot produce to be productive, to become a better person, better parents, better leaders, so you can serve your community better into enlightenment. This material here, Sahih al-Bukhari, cannot take you there. So that's one of the reasons that an-nabiyina cannot be attributed just to a selective few in the past. It has to be continually in perpetuity available to everybody who want to cultivate the quality of the higher self at any given time. So, and then another verse, 107, chapter 21. I quote that portion of the verse, Rahmatan lil alamin. Rahmatan lil alamin must be accessible at the present time. Not imagining available only for a selective few in the past, over 1400 years ago. But Rahmatan lil alamin must exist within yourself, within the person who have higher awareness. Okay, so Rahmatan lil alamin must be something that has to become the fabric of humans who has the moral clarity, who cultivate the effectiveness. Next, verse 107, chapter 21. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That the state of your well-being must become of the fabric of your way of being, must become part of human flourishing. So Rahmatan lil Alamin must be cultivated, must be accessible, must be actualized, able to actualize during the life of the human being. So Rahmatan lil Alamin, this concept cannot be just part of the past that's only reserved for a selective few, but must be part of evolution of humans at any given time. All of this because connected to wa'ati'ullah wa'ati'ur Rasool, meaning follow the messenger and follow Allah. And another portion similar to that notion, tuhibbunallah fattabi'uni. If you love Allah, you must follow me. Those two components cannot be wrapped around dogmas, cannot be wrapped around conspiracy theories and hypothesis upon hypothesis that you cannot verify the validity of the subject matter. So Allah and Rasool must within the creation themselves or itself. So Allah and Rasool they must be accessible to all humans, and that's why Allah cannot be in the realm that human cannot access. If Allah is inaccessible, Allah cannot guide you, cannot harm you, cannot do anything for you. So for Allah to be useful, for Rasool to be useful, those two components must within part of your way of being. Okay? So that's why the law that presented by the tradition happen or only occur when the Prophet comes into existence. That's according to the tradition. The verse that I'm referring to, verse 15, chapter 17, translated part of that verse, insinuate that somehow the law of God law only activated when the Prophet Muhammad came into being. That notion completely not compatible with nature. So that's why the notion of the last prophets are not aligned what the Quran is trying to present. Okay, so, and then it is important to know that in the Quran only 5 times words Muhammad occur. 4 times in the body of the surah, which is of the chapter, and then 1 time as the title of the surah. So 5 times altogether. So within that 5 times, not a single one of them, the word Muhammad referring to the tradition. That's my reading. Not a single one of the 5 times the word Muhammad occur in the Quran, not one of them referring to the character portrayed in the Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and other Islamic scholarships. So then, what is Muhammad? So Muhammad, it should be understood, if it is for humanity, if the Quran is for humanity, it should be understood as a praiseworthy. So that title is, that given title rather, must be available at any evolution of human beings. Okay, so that's why an-nabiyina, meaning it should be understood as the one that care for the soul. So an-nabiyina should not be only reserved to a selective few in the past, in the 1400 years ago, and that you have no way of knowing or access to them what they're talking about, because the time has changed. We evolve. And that's why you're not going to find the story of dinosaurs in the Quran. Okay? The Quran should talk about irrelevant issues. And the Quran is not the book of history either. So, the Quran is not, according to my reading, the Quran is not the word of God. Because the Quran cannot jump into that kind of realm, because so many notion of what God is. But the Quran is a revelation from the higher consciousness, or the revelation from the higher self. The Quran should be the book that reveals to you when you understand things factually. Okay, so that's as far as the Quran is concerned. Now, moving on, let me mention all of the places that 5 times the Quran mentioned word Muhammad. One is in verse 144, chapter Al-Imran, chapter 3. And then verse 40, chapter Al-Ahzab, chapter 33. And then in chapter Muhammad, chapter 47, 2 times word Muhammad in that chapter. One is the title of the chapter, and another one is in verse 2. And then the last one is in verse 29, chapter 48, chapter Al-Fat. So those are 5 times word Muhammad occur in the Quran. Like I said, not a single one of them, to my understanding, the word Muhammad referring to a character that presented in the book of Hadith. So Muhammadan Rasulullah that you read in verse 29, chapter Al-Fat, it should be understood as that the act, your behavior presenting what inside you. Okay, because what inside you will show up. So, and that's why sometimes you heard the word, by the fruit you shall know them, right? So that is Muhammadan Rasulullah. The quality what you presenting that's what resonates inside you. So that is what Muhammadan Rasulullah is, something that exists in creation that cultivate the quality of higher self. Another important point to understand that in the Quran there's no concept of Sunnah Muhammad or Sunnah. When I say Muhammad, the Sunnah that portray in this book. In the Quran, only Sunnatullah. Okay, very important now to understand. So that is on the side of the Quran, and why the Quran reject the notion of the last prophets or the seal of the prophets. That is because mainly is contradictory to the principles of nature. And the Quran cannot talk about things that beyond our comprehension, beyond the realm or consciousness. If it is for guidance, whatever your understanding, whatever the statement that you can come up with, must within your consciousness. Allah, Rasool, or an-nabii cannot be beyond your head. They must be within your head. Okay, so that's as far as the Quran is concerned, and that's I think it should be very clear that the Quran is not the book of history, but the book of wisdom to awaken us to the higher consciousness. And that is the only way you can get to that is while you are alive. It's not while you are under the grave or in the grave. Okay, so now let's move on the sides of the book of Hadith, and let's see how the tradition or Sahih al-Bukhari exhibit that the character being portrayed in the book is essentially a fictional character. So we are not going to look into each of the pieces because so many of them, but we are going to look at the structure, and then we are going to look into the essence of Hadith, and then you are going to look at how the Hadith pivoted to. So based on the structure of Hadith, that the Hadith portrayed by authority, not based on the truth itself or the substance itself, but based on authority, based on being told by so-and-so, and then being heard by so-and-so, and then pass on being heard by other individuals, and being understood such and such, and so forth and so forth. So those entities, which sometimes they call it science of Hadith, understand that in Islam there's no such a science of Hadith. Sanad is not science. What it is a way of to make lies. That's what Sanad is. And that's why Islam is not a religion of science, but it's a religion of faith. The problem with that is when Islam talks about faith, it talks about something that you don't understand. Something is not accessible to you. Something is beyond your head, which is not good way to cultivate your mind or to regulate yourself. Okay? So looking at the structure of Hadith, presented the narration through authority, as opposed to the truth itself that should be self-evident. Okay, so because it's not self-evident and it presenting through the change of authorities to suggest somehow there is some truth in there. So that is the first problem. That's how you know that the character, the central character in the narrations, which is Muhammad, is mainly a fictional character. That's the first dimension you can see why that it is. Second is the essence of the hadith itself, the substance. Okay, the essence of the hadith itself is not about morality or moral virtue, so you can become more productive for yourself, become useful for yourself and for others. And so the essence of hadith is ideology. That's the problem. And why? How do we know this? And that's why in the hadith there are some certain aspect of useful, but it's not useful when other people have that quality. And that is true what you find in the Quran. There are some verses in the Quran that is useful, but under tradition, under Sharia law, the useful verses in the Quran completely rejected. And that's why within Sharia law, there are the notion of no compulsion in religion is not working. And why? Because the Sharia law reconfigure that verse 256 in chapter 2 or chapter Al-Baqarah through, and it's being filtered through Al-Bukhari, through Hadith and other books of Hadith, and through fiqh such as this, okay, and Sirah Muhammad and Asbabun Nuzul and such. So the verse 256, there's no compulsion in religion, it's not working, is because it's considered no longer valid. So, in fact, I mean, that verse is supposed to be good, but it's not. It's no longer valid. It's because the tradition reject the notion of no compulsion in religion, and that also reject that if there is any good work done by other people. Let's say verse 62, chapter Al-Baqarah, that describe other folks who done good work. The verse saying that nature will guarantee prosperity, security for them and their well-being and such. But under umbrella of tradition or Islamic orthodoxy, verse 62, chapter Al-Baqarah, Islam reject that notion. And furthermore, and that's why you hear that why Muslim cannot get along with democracy, why Muslim are not accepting other faith that produce good work, part of their brothers. Because in Islamic tradition, we're supposed to hate others. And to consider others not part of our community until they take shahada. No matter how good the work they do, no matter how big contributions they have made for themselves, for their community, for the world. But until they take shahada, nothing is considered good. And that's a problem. So the purpose of the hadith is to reject some of the verse or any verses that can be useful that you can get from the Quran, but it's not being practiced, it's not usually common being understood for the goodness of the Muslim themselves. But there are certain verses in the Quran that being translated to become destructive for yourself, and that kind of verses that being deployed into the Sharia law. Okay, and that's why based on the essence of hadith that I was talking about, that the essence of Hadith is not for the goodness of people, but is for the ideology purposes only. And for the ideology is about conspiratorial theories and such, about fears, it's about ignorance, it's about projecting the falsehood, and also projecting somehow everything that you do, the result will be existed in afterlife. Okay, so, and then the orientation of the Hadith, as I said, the orientation or the Hadith which meant to be or pivoted into for the sake of ideology, or in this case for the sake of religion, not for the sake of the soul, for your own soul, not for the sake of your own well-being, not for the sake of human flourishing, none of them. So looking at that three dimension structure of Hadith, and then the essence of Hadith, and then the orientation, how the Hadith pivoted to, where is it pivoted to. So looking at that three dimensions, and then in addition to that, looking at the sanad. Sanad is not science of Hadith. It is a pseudo-science. It is a method at how to lie for the sake of religion. That's what sanad is. So putting that two together, all those four components together, explain that the character of Muhammad portrayed in Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and other Islamic scholarships, that Muhammad is only a fictional character. It's a personified character. Now we are going to talk about Islam, because you remember when the Quran rejects the notion of the last prophets, also the Quran rejects the notion of Islam portrayed in the traditions. So verse 19 and verse 85, chapter Ali Imran, that has to do with Islam. So what is Islam? If you argue whatever definition that you come out with the word of Islam, if Islam is about destructive, and then that makes the Quran irrelevant. But if you say Islam is about human flourishing, then Islam is not part of this book. This book cannot produce human flourishing, cannot produce the Islamic golden age, cannot produce, this book cannot take you to the higher consciousness. This book cannot make you to become the best version of yourself. This book cannot make you more productive, better person, so better leaders for your community, and so you can contribute for the world, for a better world, for a beautiful world. So this book is about ideology, and it's about taking you basically to live below the level of the beast. That's my understanding. You got to dig yourself. I cannot think for you. Okay, there's so many components here that I think is grossly and completely absurd, and it cannot be used as a guidance, because so much in there is hypothesis upon hypothesis upon hypothesis. So that's as far as Islam is concerned. So verse 19 and verse 85, Surah Al-Imran, that has the word Islam in there, that the Muslim use this usually to justify the religion of Islam. If you think the Quran is a book of guidance, and that guidance, the information within the book, or the understanding that you can come up with, must be factual as a guide. Okay, so if that is Islam, and that Islam become useful, but that is not kind of the word Islam that you're going to find in here. So just because the tradition using the same word Islam, that doesn't mean that what Islam means what you're going to find in here. It's two different things. The same thing as we talk about what it means an-nabii and what it means wa khataman-nabii, and as we open this discussion. So let me expand this a little bit more. One of the central teaching in tradition and why the Quran reject the notion of Islam as portrayed in the book of Sahih al-Bukhari, or in the book of tradition for that matters, that the concept of the afterlife, somehow what we do in life, the work that we do, the result you can project to the afterlife, that concept completely conflicting with nature. And that concept is self-defeating strategy. Because in nature, nothing like that. If you plug the seed of tomatoes into the ground, what will come out of the ground is tomato plants. That tomato plant will produce tomato fruits. Okay? No matter who is going to do this, either I do it, or you do it, or anybody would do it, that tomato seed will always produce tomato fruits. Okay, so and the same thing, if you are going to plant corn, the corn will produce corn. So the wisdom in that means is that the result of the seed will produce exactly what the seed does. And why is that? That is because that is what tomato fruit or tomato seed does. That is the principle of nature. The result of that plant always within the life of that plant itself. The plant never said, I will produce my fruits in the afterlife. Okay, so going back to the teaching of Islamic tradition, the notion of the afterlife is bogus, is completely unfounded. So akhirah that you find in the Quran cannot be projecting to the realm beyond your consciousness, beyond this world, this earthly world. Akhirah must within the realm yourself, within your environment. So that's why when Islam described the word akhirah means the afterlife, that notion is unfounded, that's inaccessible, is you cannot it's unusable, and it's not useful for human flourishing, and it's not useful to become more productive so you can cultivate your potential that the nature blesses you. So that is that as far as Islam, the word Islam that you find in the Quran, or Islam as a religion is concerned, that you find in tradition. Okay, so now let's look into God, the notion of God, presenting that being presented by the tradition. In the Quran, Allah, best my understanding, Allah does not mean a deity. So Allah must referring to yourself. So the Quran, when the Quran talk about Allah, the book referring to yourself, not as another deity. And that's why when you read La ilaha illa huwa, that verse, there's no a deity but your consciousness. Your consciousness, and that's all there is. And that's why when you read verse 11, chapter 13, Inna Allaha la yughayru ma biqawmin hatta yughayru ma bi anfusihim, that human cannot change their condition until they change what within their head, what between their ears. So Inna Allaha must referring to yourself. You're the one who make the change. You're the one who can understand what within your head. When you do that, but until you do that, nothing's going to change for you. So Inna Allaha la yughayru ma biqawmin hatta yughayru ma bi anfusihim, meaning humans, only human can make the change. Only human can alter your narrative. Only you can shape your vision. You create your own world, from your own consciousness. So, again, Allah in the Quran is not God. Allah in the Quran referring to your own head, your own thought, your mindset. Okay, so that's as far as Allah is concerned. So now, Allah that being understood in the tradition is God. The problem with that is when God make laws, that law that exists or that being described in this book, in this another Sharia Law, which is called Islamic law, those laws are not compatible with principles of nature. So that means Allah reject God, such God, that being described in the tradition, because it's not relevant. So the Quran is not talking about how beautiful, how God created this universe, how, what afterlife and such. But our Quran, that's my understanding, is talk about our inner psychology, or way of being, or evolution and such, so that we can understand better ourselves. Okay, now that's how I see the Quran, and you have to dig yourself. I cannot think for you. I cannot do the thinking for you. So very important to understand that the message, the theme of the message in the Quran, if it is for a guidance, and that understanding of the verse that you read must be understood in a way that can enlighten you. The understanding must exist, must accessible by you, so that it can benefit you. All right. Next, and then I want to expand a little bit about the notion of God, because Muslims ask me a lot. Then who create human beings, right? So my answer to that is, who created me? Human being. I had 2 children. I met my 2 children. So that's as simple as that. So I'm not, the Quran is not talking about who was the beginning of human being. Whenever the Quran talks about creation, it talks about that very creation produced by the creation itself. Tomato fruits only produced by tomato seed. So this nature is produced by the nature itself. So when we talk about who made human beings, who make humans, the answer is human. The same thing with the bird. Who made the bird is the birds. Okay. So That is from the perspective of Sahih al-Bukhari and from other book of Islamic tradition. That's how you know that the character that being presented in the traditions mainly a fictional character, which is Muhammad. In conclusion, the Quran, my understanding, rejects the notion of the last prophet or the seal of the prophets, simply because the principles that being taught in Islamic tradition or Islamic orthodoxy are conflicting with principles of nature. So both the Quran and the Hadith itself come to the same conclusion that the main character in Islamic tradition is mainly a fictional character, that Muhammad as the prophet that being articulating in the tradition is mainly a fictional character, a personified character.